Okay, so this is the Bible study for March 7th, 2021. We're continuing our Fulfilled series, and specifically we're studying the book of John, Gospel of John, chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. And remember that you can download PDF copies of the Bible study so that you can follow along with us at www.abqnaz.org/A.L.I.V.E. And our text for today says, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is today, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it in the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes open, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man, they asked. I don't know, he said. So this is a good text, an exciting text that I think God's going to speak to us through. Number one on our Bible study says, what was Jesus doing at the beginning of this passage when he saw the man who was blind from birth, according to 9:1? 9:1 says, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. A, teaching. B, healing. C, going along. D, he was with people. So I guess sometimes I ask questions in these Bible studies and the answer seems obvious and the answer seems simple, and it doesn't seem like there's much importance or significance to it. Most of us, as we read, we might have just read along and completely ignored this because we feel maybe that this is not the important piece of the scripture. The healing's important. It specifically records the conversation of the man with the people near his home or in his home, around his home. And so we might just say, this is not important. And so we may just ignore it entirely. But I think that it is important because it tells us something about how Jesus did ministry. It tells us something about maybe how we ought to contextualize the ministry that we do in the church, and that is that Jesus was with people. He was with his disciples. He was walking along. This was not a church service. This was not something that they put on the schedule for healings to take place. I know sometimes perhaps more Pentecostal churches do that. They have a healing service where we're going to pray and we're going to believe that God is going to bring healing. That's not what this was. It wasn't a church service like so many of us have, where we schedule a time for God or for Jesus himself to speak to us, but rather Jesus was going along and he was with his disciples, which was not an uncommon occurrence. Now, I want to point this out because the way we have sort of organized or systematized church in our culture tends to sort of only allow for Jesus to do something significant that we can learn from during an organized, scheduled, systematized church service. And I want to just point out that Jesus did a lot of his work outside of those type of settings. And when we read those type of texts, and we read them oftentimes in an organized, scheduled church setting, in a Bible study video like this, or in a Bible study that's been scheduled on a time clock, and we expect Jesus to do all his work on the time clock. Please, Jesus, will you show up at 11 o'clock on Sunday? Please, Jesus, will you show up at 9:30 when we do our Bible studies? Will you show up on Wednesday at 6? That's actually a convenient time, Jesus, for you to speak to us and to work in our lives. And we're busy right up until then. But during that time, we're going to set aside some time for you to do your work. And we schedule that for Jesus to work in us. And by the way, we also tend to schedule times like that when we want or expect for Jesus to work through us. But let me suggest that in Christ style discipleship, and we're talking a lot during this part of this series, especially about discipleship and what it looks like. The last Bible study, we talked about who are his disciples, his true disciples, as compared to those who say that Jesus, they believe in Jesus and that Jesus is working in them. And so we're talking about what true discipleship really looks like. And let me just say that true discipleship cannot be fit into a system or a time, which means we need to be with people. If we are making Christ-like disciples, which, by the way, is the mission of the Church of the Nazarene, to make Christ-like disciples. It's also the Great Commission of Jesus in Matthew 28, therefore go and make disciples. We have clarified that in the Church of the Nazarene, we believe those disciples should learn from Christ and therefore become Christ-like. And that's a part of our understanding of the holiness mission of the church and of Jesus. But we've kind of, that's the mission. And if we're to be those Christ-like disciples, or if we're to make Christ-like disciples, that will require us opening up our schedule for Jesus to be working in us and for Jesus to be working through us, often outside of the church schedule, often outside of the church building, often outside of church times. And we're going to have to just be open for Christ to work in us anytime. We're going to have to be open for Christ to work through us anytime, which means we're going to have to, sometimes we might schedule times outside of the church schedule, and God can work through that too, I think. I do believe he works in the church schedule, but I also believe that when we relegate Jesus to a schedule, then we miss a lot of times when Jesus might disciple people through us, and we might be a part of making disciples, or when we might be discipled by somebody, whether it be Christ himself or by people that know Christ very well and allow him to work through them. We might miss some of those opportunities. So Jesus was walking along, apparently with his disciples, because his disciples were there and asked him a question. And he was with people. There were people around, both his disciples and this man born blind that was here as he was walking around. So he wasn't hiding in the temple or in the synagogue. He wasn't hiding out on a mountainside away from anybody. he was with his disciples, and they together came across people who may not otherwise have come to the church or to the temple or to the synagogue. So Jesus was Jesus out amongst the people, and the church must be Jesus out amongst the people. Okay, and all the time, not just at church times. So number two, what did his disciples ask him? It says in verse 2, his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Who sinned, this man or his parents? So that's a very specific question that assumes a couple of things. One, that this guy was blind because somebody sinned. Two, that this man was born blind because of some sort of personal sin specific to this man or his parents. And so there was an assumption that was underlying this question. Um, so number three says this seems like an odd question. Why would they have asked this? The natural question when any of us encounters suffering is why. I would say that's an important thought. That we all have a tendency to ask the question why when we see someone suffering or when we are experiencing suffering. Maybe particularly when we are experiencing suffering because we seem to so often ignore the suffering of others, but we're acutely aware of our own suffering. B, it was common in that day for people to believe that all suffering was a direct result of personal sin. Now, let me stop and just define for you what we mean by when we say personal sin. So in the church, in theology, we define sin. So sin is a strange concept, and people mean lots of different things when they say sin. And so one of the distinctions that we make when we're using the word sin is personal sin versus original sin. So we say that we know that when we are born into sin. And what we mean by this is that we are sinful from birth, whether we ever commit actual personal sin or not. We are born broken and separated from God because of original sin, because we are children of Adam, because of Adam and Eve's sin in the garden, which we call original sin. We are born into sin and therefore under a curse from the beginning. So it's important to understand that that doesn't mean we've ever even actually done anything wrong. But we need the blood of Christ for salvation, whether we ever did anything wrong or not. And so we were born broken and in need of the grace that comes in the blood of Christ. And so that's what original sin is. Now, personal sin is the sin that we actually commit. And now, in the last Bible study, I talked about Wesley's concept of uh, um, sin properly so called or sin improperly so called. So Wesley talked about sin as a willful transgression against a known law of God by a responsible moral agent, and therefore it was willful transgression. But we also understand that many churches and even scripture talks about sin as missing the mark. So we talked about those distinctions among sin in the last Bible study. I'm not going to talk about that again. So feel free to go back and watch that Bible study if you have not yet, or go over that Bible study with somebody who was there with us, and you'll understand the distinctions between sin that we talked about there. But all of that, when we talk about it, is grouped under personal sin, because all of that is whether we missed the mark or whether we had a willful transgression of a known law of God, that's all personal. That's still stuff that we did. And that is distinguished from original sin, which we were born into and we are guilty of, whether we did anything or not. Now, in the Church of the Nazarene, one of the ways that I think we view original sin is we struggle with the idea sometimes of being held accountable for something that somebody did, somebody else other than us. We're okay with being held accountable for our own personal sin. Well, we're not always okay with that either, but we're more okay with that than we are about being held accountable for something that we didn't do. And so one of the ways that we look at this is that because of the sin of Adam and Eve, we are all born with a bent towards sinning. So what original sin brings in us is a bent towards sinning, a natural tendency towards sin, which we can see in sin is ultimately selfishness or self-idolatry, where we put ourselves and our own desires above the will of God. And so he is not Lord, instead we are Lord. And that's what sin is. And we are born with that tendency, selfishness. Kids steal toys from others. Why? Because they're self-centered and selfish, and they want that toy, and they don't care if the other person is hurt by their taking that toy. That's normal in children. Why? Because we're born into sin, and that is an example that shows us that because we're born into original sin, we are born with a bent towards sinning. Now, especially as we grow up and reach the age of accountability, where we can be accountable for our actions and we can know the difference rather than sort of acting on our natural instinct into which we are born. When we have the opportunity to say, yes, my tendency is to be selfish and to take this toy, but now I understand that it's not the will of God that I take this toy. By the way, as we get to be adults, it's no longer toys we're concerned with a lot of times. It's other sorts of self-pleasure and self-gratification that we move into, and other ways of hurting others, and gratifying ourselves at the expense of others, that become the real problem, and not just taking somebody's toys, although sometimes we're still taking toys, taking somebody's stuff, as adults too. But we are born bent towards that sinning, but we recognize that we can make a decision, because we understand the difference between idolatry and selfishness, and doing the will of God. We can actually make a decision to not gratify the flesh and to choose instead the will of God. And when we do that, that choice is a choice between glorifying God and personal sin. And then we have a choice whether to glorify God or have a willful transgression, because we have the choice and we know what we're doing when we choose it. Willful transgression against the known law of God. So, what we're talking about here when the disciples ask him this question is personal sin. They ask, did this man sin, or his parents? And when we ask the question of why, it says in B, back to number 3 and answer B, it was common in that day for people to believe that all suffering was a direct result of personal sin, something they did. Now, let me be clear, all suffering is a result of sin. Sin in this world, sin, the bent towards sinning that we are all born into because original sin exists and we're all born into it, suffering exists. And it would not exist if it weren't for sin. And sometimes that means that somebody's personal sin has caused my suffering. In fact, often I think it is true that somebody's personal sin has caused my suffering, but it is not always, and this is a mistake we make in the church, it is not always my personal sin or my parents' personal sin. It is often some person that I don't even know who has caused this problem in the world, or people that I do know that choose selfish behaviors instead of the will and the glory of God, and instead of my good, and choosing to love God and love others, to love me enough to not take their own selfish desires first, but to choose selflessness and choose the will of God and my good. Okay, so that's often the case of suffering, the cause of suffering. And so so it's true that suffering is caused by sin, and that's why it can be very confusing when there's suffering. And we need to understand that it's not the will of God that any should suffer, but it is often allowed by God because he has given us each free will, and because he has decided not to overcome our free will and we can choose to sin, then suffering exists in this world. But it's not always our sin that's caused our own suffering. I think sometimes pastors and well-meaning people come into a situation and we're suffering, and they find whatever thing, see, it's your fault. And look, sometimes suffering is our own fault. I've looked at my life and said, yeah, I'm suffering right now because I did something stupid, because I was ungodly, because I chose against the will of God, and I'm experiencing suffering. Sometimes we can see the specific examples where our parents have done ungodly things and we are suffering as a result. We can see that in children's life. Let's just look at the CYFD custody situation and so many of the kids that we may have encountered where they're suffering as a result of something their parents did. When we talk about fetal alcohol syndrome, who sinned, this person or his parents, that he's suffering? It's not his sin. He was not even born yet. But yes, his parents did something that has caused suffering in his or her life. Okay, so we understand that sometimes it is personal sin on the part of the person or their parents that caused this suffering. But in this case, Jesus said it is not. See, since the man was born blind, it was difficult to understand how he could have sinned personally to cause this. And that was maybe the default. So then they were trying to put the blame on his parents. They were asking, maybe it was his parents. If it wasn't him, who else could it be? If we believe that sin is caused, or personal sin on the part of the person who's suffering is always the cause of suffering, then we can't blame it on him. Then we have to find somebody else to blame it on. Perhaps it was his parents, but Jesus says that's not the answer. So number 4 asks, how did Jesus answer? He said in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, this phrase, this verse, if we don't understand it properly, can cause us all sorts of trouble in reading into it something that Jesus did not intend, I believe. So we're going to ask a couple of questions here that clarify what Jesus was trying to say there. So number 5, did Jesus really mean to say that this man and his parents were without sin? So he said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Yes, no, explain. I would say, no, he did not intend to say that this person, this man or his parents were completely without sin. What he intended to say, what he meant by what he was saying, was that neither this parent man nor his parents' sin was the cause of his suffering in this case. So he wasn't trying to say neither of them sinned, blanket, but what he was trying to say was that neither of them caused this blindness by their sin specifically. So that's what Jesus was really intending in number 5, I believe, based on the context of the text. Okay, number 6, did Jesus intend to say that God caused this man to be blind? So when he says neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him, we might confuse what he's saying to mean that God caused this man to be blind so that he might be glorified. And I don't think that that's true. I think it might be right to say God allowed this suffering, the attack of the enemy to happen, and he did not protect this man in the way that we would have perhaps hoped that he would, so that he did not have to suffer, but he allowed the attack of the enemy to happen. He allowed the personal sin of people. He allowed the original sin of Adam and Eve that brought on sickness and suffering in general in this world. And all of that, his allowing all of that to happen, um, caused caused this man's blindness, but he was going to work and show the glory of God in this man's life. So it's not all over for this man. This man gets an experience that very few have, to experience the power and the glory of God. And God can use this in and through this man's life. So A in number 6 says, yes, that is why he shouldn't believe in God, or that is why we shouldn't believe in God. So unfortunately, the problem of pain, sometimes it's called, or the problem of human suffering, is the cause of many people either deciding that God does not exist or that God exists, but he is not good. And I have personally encountered people that have come to this conclusion, um, and they've come to that conclusion because suffering exists in this world. I would say that Lee Strobel's A Case for Christ is a good um, and is a good argument against thinking this way. And you could go read that book. I would say that there's a Nazarene author that makes a case for free will and God's love being expressed through free will in his people, which has caused so much pain, that actually has some good thoughts in it. Um, but we'll go on talking about this ourselves, and you can go read those if you're not entirely convinced yet. B says no, God did not intend, or Jesus did not intend to say God caused this man to be blind. No, sin, not God, is always the cause of suffering. It's just not always the sin of the individual who is suffering or his family. Sometimes there is no easy answer to why bad things happen to us other than there is sin in the world. Sometimes that's the best answer, and we don't like that answer. But we do like, by the way, having the free will that has for God to allowed for sin to exist in the world. We like free will, and also we like the idea that we have free will and we choose to follow God, which, by the way, we could not choose to follow God and express love for God unless there exists a choice not to follow God and love God. And so we like the fact that we can choose to love God and we can choose not to love God. And that seems to be especially meaningful when people choose to love us and we realize they had a choice not to love us. When they choose to do good to us and we realize they had a choice not to, but they chose to instead, then that is very meaningful. And that would not exist if it weren't for free will and the option for people to choose not to love God or love us. But that choice that people have not to love God or love us is exactly what has caused this human suffering. And so we would not know what it means to love if we didn't know what it means to essentially hate, and to choose sin and to choose hate instead. Um, and so it's important that we understand that this is all part of it, and we like one part of it, but we don't like the other part of it. See, no, Jesus is not saying God caused this man to be blind. No, but he was demonstrating Romans 8:28 by showing that God can use even bad things to work for the good of his people. So Romans 8:28 says, for we know that God, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So even though God did not cause suffering, but he did, by giving us free will, allow suffering, yet he can work for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose in the midst of suffering. That is an important thought. And so Jesus was pointing out how God was about to work for his glory and for our good in the midst of this. And we need to remember that as people of God. D, no, but Jesus was trying to get his people to focus on how God was working in the situation rather than why it's happening. Isn't it so common for us to get so caught up in the why? Why did this happen, that we miss what God is trying to do in the middle of it? And Jesus is redirecting them. So he's saying, oh, you're asking why. None of that is why, but the real thought that's important here is, what is God going to do in the midst of this? So we often miss what God is doing in the midst of it because we're so busy asking why. We may not ever fully understand the why until we're with God in heaven. But if we stop asking why long enough to see what God is doing in the midst of it, we may see some amazing works of God that we would have otherwise missed. And I think Jesus would have us redirect our attention to what God is doing in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of our problems, instead of constantly focusing on why and allowing that to turn us away from God. Number 7, why did Jesus do, or what did Jesus do, and how was God displayed in him? So he said this happened so that God could be displayed. Okay, how was God displayed? Well, God was displayed in what Jesus did here. Let me just remind you of that sometimes God is not displayed in the situation until we do something as a representative of God. And it's important for us not to just sit and wait for God to be displayed, but let's display God in the situation. And Jesus did that. In this case, by spitting on the ground, we think, couldn't he have displayed God in a more appealing way? We don't like the thought of, I don't like the thought of saliva in my eye, mud in my eye. I don't like any of that, but perhaps God, this was the most obvious way that God could be displayed in this situation. So Jesus spit on the ground, made mud with his saliva, wiped it in the man's eyes, and then told him, blind with mud and spit in his eyes, to go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he sent him to wash in the sent pool. And ask, and by the way, it said the man went home seeing, and then it clarifies when he's telling the story that he didn't see when Jesus spit, he didn't see when Jesus wiped the mud, he saw after he had washed. So this is another example. Not We're not talking about that so much in this Bible study, but we've talked about it before, and I want to remind you that this is another miracle that is an example of the miracle didn't happen right when Jesus did the thing. It didn't happen until the person obeyed Jesus. So Jesus empowered the miracle, but Jesus sent the person. And until the person obeyed, the miracle didn't fully take place. And so, what would have happened if he hadn't went and washed? If he went home and just threw some water on it from somewhere else and didn't go and do the thing that Jesus told him? We don't know. Praise God. This is an example of somebody that obeyed Jesus, and in faith, Jesus acted, and it was the cooperation of God and us that brought the miracle. I imagine there were many other examples where Jesus was ready to do a miracle and sent somebody, and they did not do the thing that he said because they did not believe in him and have the faith, and then the miracle didn't take place, and the story was not recorded. Why wasn't it recorded? Because there was no miracle. Why wasn't there a miracle? Because we did not do our part, not because Jesus didn't. So I just want to point out that I would say in our lives, there may be many missing miracles because we have not cooperated with God in what he wanted to do. It's not because he was missing, it was because we were missing in action. Um, Number 8, in what area of your life might you need to look for how God is working or going to work rather than ask why? Should we be looking for the areas where God is working or where he is trying to work? And I would say yes, we need to look for the areas he's trying to work, but he maybe can't work because we're too busy asking why. What might he call us to do to cooperate with him so that he can work a miracle? And we're so busy asking the why of the suffering that we have not stopped to see what he's trying to do if we would just listen and follow him and obey him. Number 9, what happened when the man returned home, according to verses 8 through 12? A, people recognized him from when he used to beg. Yes, that's true. B, people thought he was a different person who only looked like the man who used to beg. This is funny. This guy is no longer, well, let's just say that probably if he was a beggar, he was without some of the um, hygiene items and products, and he wasn't able to take care of himself as well as he might have been able to if he had money and if he could see. And so he was a beggar, and I imagine it was not much unlike the folks that we meet on the street around our ABQ Central location who are not able to care for themselves either and often are begging. And maybe he stunk a little, and maybe he didn't have clean or mended clothes, and he had been begging. But now he looked a lot like this guy that we saw begging, except for he has washed in the pool of Siloam, and so now he's cleaner, and maybe he has new clothes on. And now here he is. He looks like that guy, but different. There's definitely something different about him, and he's not blind. So that's a big difference. So they weren't sure. Maybe it was his brother. Maybe it was somebody that just looked like him. And so they did not fully believe that this was the same man. See, people had trouble believing that a man who had been blind his whole life could be healed. Uh, You would be surprised if somebody who had been blind like this his whole life suddenly showed up and was not blind and had washed. You would be surprised too. D, people wanted to find Jesus, the man who healed this man. Who healed you? Jesus. Where is this man? They said. I don't know. He slipped away. He's gone. He healed me and now he's gone. How do people feel about your testimony? There's some who may not immediately believe that you've changed. If they've only seen you in this way, they might believe that you were never that person, because they have a hard time believing that that sort of person could really be changed. They might see you after many years and not really believe that you're the same person. But if they come to the conclusion that you are the same physical person, but you are very different, then I believe they will want to know who did this. The scripture says, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have. You're different. Who did this? And then where is this person? And where can I find this person? And we need to be ready to share that. But before any of that happens, they have to see that there's something different in us. And they won't see that until we stop asking the why of the suffering and we decide to allow, to cooperate with Jesus and allow him to do something new in our lives.